would like to thank you for watching our podcast as we study through the book of 2 Corinthians. Today we're in 2 Corinthians, the 8th chapter, starting with verse number 7. Now the Apostle Paul is still talking about taking an offering. Now let me just say this. Taking an offering is an essential part of every church and of every Christian organization. It's very important that people are instructed on how to take an offering, or that leaders are instructed on how to take an offering, and that people are instructed on the importance of an offering. And so that's why the Apostle Paul is using this 8th chapter from the very beginning to the end, talking about the importance of an offering. And one of the key words here in this chapter is the word earnest. And we're going to talk about that some today, but it means a deep desire. And let me just say this. Your offering should flow from a deep desire in your heart. Now, this week we're going to talk about some things that are extremely important in taking an offering. But let's start with verse number 7, where the Apostle Paul writes this, and he says, "But just as you are abounding in everything, in faith and utterance and knowledge, and in all earnestness," there's that word, "and in the love that we inspire in you, see that you abound in this gracious work also." Now, what's the Apostle Paul doing? He's really giving the Corinthians a wonderful, wonderful compliment when he says that you abound in everything. In other words, the Apostle Paul says you are overflowing in every area of your lives and of the church. And then he says in faith. The Corinthian church is abounding in faith. Their faith is up. Their faith is active. Now, the word faith is not just what we would many times think of as something that's active. The word faith actually means in your persuasions or your convictions. The Apostle Paul is saying to the Corinthians, you are people that now have some convictions. You have some persuasions. You know God. And so he says, your faith. And then he goes on, he says, and utterances. And this is the word logos, it means an intelligent speaking. How many of you realize that one of the things that the Corinthians prided themselves in is the ability to speak and in wisdom? Well, now he starts with faith, and now we have to understand, because Paul starts with this word faith, that their utterances are now words of conviction, words of faith, words of belief in their life. And then he goes on and he says this, and knowledge. The Corinthians prided themselves in knowledge, but now it's a knowledge of the faith. It's a knowledge of who God is. It's a knowledge of who they are. And so he says, and of knowledge, and in all earnestness. This word earnestness again means a deep down desire. And then he goes on and he says, and in the love that we inspired in you. Now notice Paul says that we inspired in you. How many of you realize that love is always inspired by something outside? We love him because he first loved us. You want someone to love you? First love them. That's what Paul is saying here. He's saying we inspired love on the inside of you, Corinthians. And then he goes on and he says these words, see that you abound in this gracious work also. What's he talking about? He's talking about the work of this offering that he's asked them to take. He's saying, we want you to go beyond. The word abound means to go beyond what you have. And so the Apostle Paul, again, is talking about the taking of this offering. And the offering, by the way, is not for Paul. The offering is for the saints in Jerusalem. We talked about that last week. Verse number 8 says this, I am not speaking this as a command. Paul's not commanding them to give, but as proving through the earnestness of others the sincerity of your love also. What's Paul saying? He's saying your deep desire for others. You see, an offering needs to come out of a deep desire. An offering, we talked last week, it needs to come from the grace of God. An offering needs to come from a deep desire. If you don't desire in your heart to give to a work, then don't give in the offering. But Paul here is saying, he says, we want to prove through the earnestness of others the sincerity of your love. The earnest desire for other people is proven that you have a sincere love for someone else. You see, just to say I love you is not enough. You need to prove that you have a deep desire for someone else by your love. And Paul is telling these Corinthians, he said, now prove it by your offering. Prove it by your giving. Let's move on to verse number 9. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. Now there's that word grace again. The grace, the unmerited favor that causes and gives us the ability to change. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich. What's the Apostle Paul saying? The Apostle Paul is telling us that God's unmerited favor came, and because of grace, Jesus, who was rich. How many of you realize that Jesus was abundantly rich? We cannot understand the riches of God. We can't understand. He owns everything. He owns, the old song, he owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Well, you know what? That's absolutely right. He not only owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, he owns the hills. He owns everything. But Paul is writing here and he's saying, for we know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor. What's Paul saying? He's saying because of the grace that our Lord Jesus had, he became poor by giving of himself on the cross. And then he goes on in the last part of verse number 9, so that you through his poverty might become rich. So that you through his poverty might become rich. What's the Apostle Paul? What's the context of this verse? And by the way, this verse many times is taken out of context. Well, what's the context of this verse? The context is that you need to give in the grace of God. And you need to give to these people who are very poor. Now keep in mind, Corinth is one of the richest cities at this time. One of the richest cities at the time that the Apostle Paul is writing. Jerusalem and the saints in Jerusalem are extremely poor. They have lost everything. So Paul is saying, take your riches and make those poor people rich. And then he goes on and he says, in your poverty, he says, so that you through his poverty might become rich. That you through his poverty might have all the riches that God has. My time is up for today. God bless you. Thank you for watching.